Your card is going so well. No smudge stamping, coloring is spot on, except you still need a sentiment on there. Nope, not there. Ugh. Maybe it's time for a new trend, sentimentless cards. I think we better just work this out. We're going to talk about 3 sentiment placements that can sabotage your card design and 4 that will totally make it. So glad you're here. I'm Carrie at Kill Revival, and I'm all about helping you see what you and your stash can do. Let's dig into that stash and pull out the sentiments. We're going to take a look at how to use them in ways that really complement your card design. Now, keep in mind, these sentiment rules, they're kind of like grammar rules. I before E, except when it's E before I. The word but should never start a sentence, but sometimes it totally should. These rules are just a great framework to start from. Let's start off with the don'ts. Don't fill in the white space. It's tempting to use that wide open empty space for your sentiment, but don't. Let that empty space be. That is your white space, and it's doing 2 super important things for your card design. It keeps the design from getting too visually overwhelming for a viewer, where things are just coming every which way at them. White space can create this sense of calm. And secondly, it helps whatever's meant to stand out to stand out. Like if you had a strong sentiment taking up the white space and then a focal point image somewhere else, the 2 would compete with each other to be the primary focal point. As you place your sentiment, just make sure it doesn't eat up your white space and that it's not competing with the focal point. Don't place your sentiments totally disjointed from the rest of the card elements, like way out yonder. You might think, oh, this one's such a small sentiment, it's not gonna compete as the focal point, or it's not big enough to eat up all my white space. And sure, that's probably true, but putting it in the middle of nowhere is just visually confusing. The design won't feel unified. It'll be like having all these separate elements kind of spread around the card. But what you want is for each piece to work together to create a whole, including your sentiment. The last spot to avoid putting a sentiment is a very loose rule. I could see us totally breaking this one. In fact, I do. So let's just call this a recommendation to pause and think if there's any other options you might want to go with. It's centering the sentiment above or below a perfectly centered image. Now, this setup checks the other boxes. There could be plenty of white space, and the image and sentiment would be visually unified. But with all the elements centered and evenly spaced, you might be missing out on something more visually exciting, like adding in some asymmetry or having a layout where the eye moves from point to point along a more interesting path. Now, with this rule and the others, go ahead and break them when you feel like it. But knowing why you might want to avoid the placements is going to help you make that decision. Let's talk about the 4 sentiment do's. Plus, I've got a bonus tip for you at the end about subsentiments. The first sentiment placement you likely use 9 times out of 10. It's the opposite of putting it out in the middle of nowhere. Instead, you want that sentiment to have some type of relationship with the other card elements. This looks like having the sentiment close enough to those elements that they visually make a new group. This could look like nestling it to one side of an image or grouping, or you can put a sentiment overlapping another element. Often it'd overlap the focal point. You could have it centered over it or even offset. The sentiment could be on a strip that runs underneath or across the focal point. Or it could just be grounded to a grouping by being just outside the strip that everything else is on. But wherever it goes, just make sure your sentiment is close enough to be anchored to a grouping. The next do is using your sentiment as the main focal point on a card. Focal points don't always have to be an image, right? In fact, it's way more unexpected when the sentiment is the focal point. So it's kind of fun to do designs like this sometimes. But how do you make the sentiment the focal? Does it just need to be bigger or what? Well, size is one factor, but it really just comes down to whatever has the most visual weight on the card. That's what's going to draw your eye first. You can create weight with a bigger size or stronger contrast. Like, what is popping off that background? That could be something that's different than the rest. Like if the whole card is smooth and the sentiment's textured, frames going around, or lines intersecting underneath. All of these things can play a part in creating visual weight somewhere on the card. And you don't need them all. You just need enough so that the sentiment clearly grabs your attention first. The next two sentiment placements are much more subtle. The first is integrating your sentiment into a scene. Some stamp sets are even made for this, like ones where the sentiment gets stamped right on a little note, or sets with balloon strings that are a scripty font. But you can get really creative using any sentiment you have as part of a scene. It doesn't have to be made to do it. And this is a really fun creative stretch. You can stamp flower stems, or if it's a really long sentiment, you could curve it and create hills or rainbow arches. You could stamp on the spine of a book or on a computer or phone screen. Tons of sentiment possibilities in your scenes. Another sentiment do is using it as a repeating pattern. You're going to take that sentiment and turn it into a graphic element. You could mix and match multiple sentiments or just take one and use it on repeat. And there's all sorts of looks you can do. Go black and white, different colors. You could fill the entire background with that sentiment pattern or just mask off a small area or do it on a die cut. I really love this look because by making the sentiment into a pattern, it takes away its visual weight because pattern kind of recedes and becomes a background. And then your focal point can really pop. But you got to use as many sentiments as you could possibly want. It's just a fun combo. Now here's that extra tip. What about the subsentiments? If you ever want to use them, then you've got even more distinct elements you're trying to bring together. But all you need to do is treat the main sentiment and subsentiment the same way we've been talking about. They just need to have a visual relationship to each other. So nestling them nearby or stacking the subsentiment on top, that could be either centered or offset. And some interesting ways to add in that subsentiment are stamping it on a banner or a teeny tiny sentiment strip, or it could even be a really long strip that spans your whole card. I especially love using small die cut fonts over large ones. There's so many options. Sentiments don't need to be a huge pain to work into your finished layout. Instead of always being an afterthought, what if they were equally important to the whole making process? A shift to planning with the sentiment in mind opens you up to completely new creative options. And speaking of which, I actually have even more sentiment ideas for you. 5 really fun techniques that make the sentiment the star. Plus, you'll see me breaking one of my own rules. But remember, it's like grammar. You can break them too. Check it out right here, and I will see you there.